So first, let me repeat the question. So he's asking about the use of create2 and the dark spell mechanism that I mentioned. So that was specifically for a case where you can't actually reveal what the fix is because it would reveal the bug and someone would exploit it. And so with create2, you can announce, look, it's going to be deployed at this address. And once you have an address, then a governance proposal can be entered that gives that address permissions to do things with the system. But there's no code yet there, so the bad guys don't yet know what that code is going to do. And so create2 is just the technical mechanism that allows you to know that when you deploy a contract, it'll have this deterministic address.
Thank you. And the second question for Uniswap. I thought under proof of stake, censoring transactions would actually slash your stake. And there has been a major discussion with the current tornado cash fiasco where people were saying if Coinbase, for instance, sanctioned transactions related to Tornado Cash, that their stake would be actually slashed. And most of the community actually agreed to that.
Yeah, good question. Thanks.
So I don't think it's actually risk-free to carry this under proof of stake.
Oh, sure. Can you guys hear me through the mic now? Yeah. So his question was, there's some talk about like a slashing mechanism for censoring transactions under proof of stake. Not my area of expertise by any means, but my understanding was that this kind of like one-time block production where you can include your, swap back attack and demanipulation without including other swaps wouldn't be detectable as that kind of censoring. Not entirely sure on this. Maybe I can get back to you if you DM me on Twitter or something later.
Yeah. I can speak to that quickly. Like the censorship you're talking about is someone proposed a block and then like other validators refuse to like vote on that fork. Then there's potentially for like stake leakage and like slashing for like not selecting that fork. But like if no one is willing to propose the transaction or if you've bought all the proposer slots, then you can.
What you're saying is completely true, but my discussion is for actually censoring transactions.
Yeah, what I'm saying is someone has to. The current Ethereum proof of stake system can only detect censorship on a branch, not like no one was willing to propose the block with that transaction in it.
Correct, but my discussion, the community will actually vote for slashing.
I think the attack would have succeeded and the money would be gone by the time like anything like that happened. So, all right, cool.
Yeah, got a question for Kurt and Jared. When you two give the talk.
If you stand up, then you'll be the next question. Yes.
When you gave the talk, you mentioned a term like called security versus safety. You also say safety is larger than security, and I think Jared also used the term safety. So I just want to clarify: are we referring anything more than just the code? Bugs. When you mention safety, I just want to see if there's a concept you try to deliver because your title also mentions safety.
Yeah, well, I'll just give my definitions for how I think about the terms security and safety. For me, security means that some malicious entity cannot cause harm. Safety means that harm does not occur to any entities associated with the protocol, like end users, token holders, etc. So, and harm in a DeFi sense is usually a financial loss. But the more general definition would be, just no harm occurs. You can think of that as actually maybe a higher level than safety, which would be correctness, right? Because you'd never design something that would be unsafe. But correctness tends to be like a moving goalpost, right? Because you're always changing your protocol. It's very hard to define and even harder to prove. So I think safety is the most useful one in practice because a loss is a loss to a user, whether a hacker caused it or not.
Yeah, totally agree that it's about protecting users and their funds, and it doesn't matter how you get there, but that's like the goal. And, the other terms are relevant, although I think Kurt has a much more scientific definition than I still have for now.
Hey, my question is for Mark and Uniswap. You mentioned for the device manipulation attacks, it's like you need to have like crazy capital, 3 days, right? But this is like, as you mentioned, way more than we have on crypto. It's like the number is a bit too speak. Can you maybe explain why you use that much capital?
Sure, yeah. And keep in mind that those numbers were for the ETH to USDC pool, which is highly liquid. So the reason the number was so ridiculously high was that you needed to move the price in a single block, in my simulations there, in a single block such that the entire 144 block TWAP was a 30% price increase. So you weren't moving the price 30%. If I had the simulation with me, I could tell you the exact, but you're like making it so ETH looks like it's worth $100,000 or something like that, so that the average TWAP is a 30% increase, if that makes sense. So
it's also like in that case, I'm not sure that you actually need that much capital as well, because I mean there is a constraint liquidity in Uniswap protocol, right? Once you escape to the area with low liquidity, you actually
yeah, exactly. So these simulations were running on the actual Uniswap v3 ETH USDC pool with the liquidity distribution at the time that I simulated it. You're totally right, though. If there happened to be some other pool that had discontinuous liquidity or some like different liquidity spectrum, the cost may have been different. To be honest, I used that pool because I thought the number was, it made the point better. Surely there's other pools with less liquidity that would require a more reasonable amount of funds to actually move the price, but these are longer tail, lower liquidity assets, right? Yeah.
100,000 ETH is FUD.
Yeah.
So you mentioned like about the TWAP median, using a median instead of TWAP, but like if let's say like the price is stable for a while and then there's a big volatility change, doesn't that mean it'll take like a long time for the price to update? Isn't that an issue? At least with the TWAP, it'll slowly like update, right?
Yeah, sure. So there are definitely some trade-offs with the median TWAP approach. So yeah, exactly. If the price were to truly move, like globally, a certain amount, it would take half the window size for that to register on the median TWAP as well. Similar problem exists with the mean TWAP, as you mentioned, but it's sort of a slow increase as opposed to a discontinuous, a sharp increase when it hits the half window size. Sort of the counterpoint to this is that with the median TWAP, as I mentioned in my talk, you can use a smaller window because it filters out the outliers better. So you can make the trade-off such that it's not so bad.
All right, thank you.
So I was actually asked a similar question about like what are the trade-offs of median, because it seems like a pretty elegant solution overall, but you basically answered that question, so I guess I'll just ask in general. Like for those of you who are taking a lot of either third-party contributions or you're basically having to figure out how to create good processes but potentially involve larger communities outside of a single team, are there any like challenges and then ways that you've mitigated the problem of just coordinating larger groups of people but still having good security process? It's like open.
Yeah, I have a...
I think Mike's
on. Yeah, thanks, Michael. I have definitely have thoughts on that. Also related to the case that Emilio brought up about for Compound. That was one of the first community contributions for Compound that led to that issue is actually very easily preventable, but also inevitable because there wasn't processes. And this predates the time where Open Zeppelin was actually working for the DAO, and kind of led to that, actually as the outcome. But yeah, I mean, I think this is a very important part of security and safety for protocols that have decentralized governance. This is one of the reasons that I actually wanted to share my thoughts with everybody and larger communities, because I think there just needs to be a norm of how you go about making changes and ensuring that they're safe, because I think it doesn't matter how great the processes are at Compound Labs or at any company if changes can come from outside of that and people don't necessarily follow those processes. So it just needs to be more of a norm, I think.
Yeah, I'll say a few things about this. At Maker, we're starting to have some other teams starting to do a little bit of smart contract code. And so what we try to do is have the sort of core protocol engineering team work very closely with those teams and try to impart the engineering culture and lessons to them. I think like the more sci-fi longer term thing is that we'd just like to have very powerful automated testing so that when a change is proposed, it can sort of be simulated and various properties or economic scenarios can be thrown at it and see how it behaves, although that's still in progress. We've got some big integration tests just finishing up, so I think, yeah, that's the future.
Yeah, I have some comments as well. I mean, I think like what we should try to strive for as well, especially in more complex protocols like Compound, like Maker, like AAVE, where there are multiple risk parameters, like features and interactions. Like there is a difference that I always make between protocols like Uniswap, for example, in which the use cases are usually very simple, like the way the user interaction happens with the protocol is super simple and usually immediate. So you do your swap, that's it. And protocols like AAVE, like Compound Maker, where users actually keep position open for an undetermined amount of time, where the protocol needs to properly manage liquidity risk, Oracle risks, and so on and so forth. So protocols like Uniswap, where the use case is very small and very limited, are more easy to make immutable because they require little to no maintenance, right? You create the Uniswap pool, pretty much that's it. Then maintaining the usefulness of the Uniswap pool then is up to liquidity providers, right? In AAVE or Compound Maker, that's much more complicated because the users, liquidity providers, are continuously exposed to a different set of risks that need to be managed over time. So AAVE or Compound Maker might require a risk parameter change, smart contract fixes because of, I don't know, like some underlying protocol that Maker or AAVE rely on, like they change their, for example, their business definitions and so on and so forth. So I think long term, to prevent this kind of issues, what we should aim for is trying to reduce as much as possible, like governance participation as well. Like, I hope at some point we arrive I hope we arrive to a point where the technology is mature enough where we can actually limit the amount of code that we push to production smart contracts in a way that this also helps, of course, with limiting the possible surface of mistakes. If you need to push less code to production, then of course there is less risk of introducing bugs. So I think that is also a very important aspect of security and safety, that is like reducing governance participation to the bare minimum. This can be controversial, it can be difficult, especially right now where the technology is evolving very quickly and these protocols need to evolve with the technology because of the complexity of these protocols. But hopefully the technology will be mature enough at some point that we can reduce the actual impact of governance proposals on the technology itself. And they become more autonomous running software, essentially.
My question is for any speaker who has an opinion on this. What are your thoughts on test-driven development?
Okay, I can go quickly because I mentioned it in the. I think that's an amazing tool for testing mission-critical software like smart contracts. I think it's particularly well suited for smart contracts because they are usually not particularly complex. Architecturally speaking, I mean, they are compared to, for example, front ends or API or backends that you need to build on top of other technologies, where like the integration with other technologies is also fundamental. In those particular, in those particular layers of the stack, applying test-driven development could be trickier. In smart contracts, I think they are very well suited for test-driven development, like tools like Foundry. It's amazing, for example, for a smart contract, for test-driven development, because you can write your tests and the code of the contract in Solidity. So test-driven development means you write the test first, and then based on the outcome of the test, you write the actual code that makes the test first fail and then pass, and then there is the loop, red, green, refactor, right? So I think it's an amazing tool. It cannot, in my opinion, it's very hard to apply all the time because then when you start building on top of test-driven development, like it becomes very, very complex to handle at some point. Like the test can become very overwhelming compared to the code that you need to write. But in general, when you write very contained small unit of software, I think it's pretty useful, and I think it should be one of the key components of safe and secure smart contract development.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I'll say I've only used test-driven development myself a few times, but every time I did, it actually worked pretty well.
Yeah.
So maybe we should use it more.
Hi, Rex from DeFi Safety. You've talked a lot about spec, code, test. Do you think you're getting close to traceability where you document from spec to code to test results?
So the question is, are we getting close to traceability from spec to test to code to test? Well, certainly everything is traceable. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by traceability. I mean, certainly everything, is that a specific term that you're referring to? Like,
aerospace software, you've got to document every step. You can start anywhere in the chain, you can go up and down on everything.
It's like a tool for root cause analysis, basically, structure for it.
Yeah, this might be outside of my knowledge, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I think we try to do everything in a fully documented way, and keep the spec together with the code, and keep that. If you make a change to the code, then that should be reflected back in the spec. And I don't know. I think it's difficult to. I don't know if there's specific tools that people have for enforcing that, which I don't know about. But yeah, I think to the extent. It should be as formal as possible, between those steps. But it's always going to, as in my experience, it's always been somewhat human driven and error prone because of that. Kurt may have more to say about this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we're like at an aerospace level of rigor yet in DeFi. Maybe we'll get there eventually. But generally, a lot of things are recorded now, right? Like, I've often gone back to, like mine past GitHub discussions and see like, okay, I know we were talking about this thing back then, what did we say? And you can really, like there have been cases where I've, very, in great detail traced to like where the design decision happened and where in the process it occurred. I still think there's maybe a ways to go in improving, like the formal, like, okay, we have a spec and then we had the, the design and implementation and the testing and like, here's where things got wrong. But I'd say in practice, we can usually pinpoint things pretty well.
Hi, I'm Kanashka Da Silva. I wanted to ask, you've mentioned that smart contracts should be treated as mission-critical application. Are there any standardization or methodologies that are in place right now, like the OWASP security principle that I possibly don't know about as it relates to smart contract or blockchain application security?
I guess every team, should I repeat the question? Everyone has heard the question? Like the question is in general, like, are there some standard practices and procedures for writing smart contracts like mission critical software? I don't think there are standards that are industry wide in the sense that for sure between us, like essentially here, I think we have the top 4 DeFi protocols. So I think between us, more or less in different ways, we follow the same developments, the same development flow and development strategies. There is nothing really standardized in the sense there is not a standard development flow that all of us follow in the same way. Everyone has actually their own internal development and security practices, but eventually we will converge in doing more or less the same things because we are not really reinventing anything. Like it was mentioned right before, like aerospace industry. I mentioned NASA, mission critical software is all around us, like everywhere, like people lives is impacted and potentially disrupt. That's mission critical software. It could be microcontrollers, it could be aerospace software, space like mission software. It could be, I don't know, your oven, can be whatever, anything that could impact your life. So we are not really reinventing anything. We are just essentially adapting what we already know to a technology that is somewhat different because of the nature of the technology itself. But ultimately, like, the goal is to bring, as much safety as possible and security in our industry, because it impacts people's life, essentially.
One thing I have seen out there, there's like a registry of common smart contract, like bugs and vulnerabilities, SWC or something like that. I don't know. I've run across it a couple times, and so, that sort of parallels, registries of vulnerabilities from traditional software. And I think you'll see more of those things, arise and become sort of industry standards as time goes on.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is maybe that it's just the challenge. I think is you can have. I don't think there's any, like, the best practices already exist. Probably coming from different industries, it's like, how do you know about all these things? How do you force people to follow these processes, especially in a decentralized environment where changes can come from anywhere and people can launch new protocols? There's really no way to enforce it except through the governance processes, through the norms. And having conferences like these. So, but yeah, I feel like the processes all exist, but getting the collection of what is the best practice and documenting that and getting agreement is the hard part. So maybe that's what we're doing here.
Quick question. So Kurt, you talked of the whole security mindset, culture, procedures. But it's easy for those to drain away over time. Teams change, and people don't have the same philosophy, or you're not into it. How do you keep that paranoia level, following the checklist kind of culture and actually happening 2 years from now or 3 years from now?
Yeah, well, reading wrecked news is a good way to just scare yourself periodically. I think with the frequency of DeFi exploits, that actually has, helped keep everyone, nose to the grindstone on safety and security. But you're right that, culture creep, is something you have to watch out for. And it comes down to having strong enough transmission mechanisms within your team dynamics. So, not just everybody working alone independently. If you're remote, you've got to have those video calls and really make it clear that it's important. I mean, if it does come up that maybe someone on the team is not following the practices and procedures, you've got to have a way to kind of talk to them and be like, this is what matters. And so it's, I think so long as you don't snap your fingers and drain all the people who have that culture within them out of the team, all of a sudden they can transmit it to other members. But it does have to be a conscious mechanism of bringing people, along for the ride. Like, oh, okay, you're new. Well, come sit in this review session and just get used to, this is how we do things. That I don't know.
Yeah, I have a comment on that because, what you mentioned of passing down the culture to every contributor kind of makes it's even more complicated, with the technologies they're working on and with the decentralized approach, not only to the software itself, but to the development. Because, for example, right now I work collaborate with AAVE, I work with BGD, but ultimately I'm a community contributor, right? So I work as a community contributor. I try to keep doing what I was doing before, but with a different approach, trying to involve more people that it's not necessarily my employee, but just people that wants to participate in the development of a technology that is for everyone because it's decentralized. So this brings further complexities because you could have contributors in your protocol or in your decentralized application that they were not even part of your team. Someone sees a part of code, they wants to contribute somehow, they create a PR for your code, right? And how do you ensure that PR is actually following your best practice. You usually reject it the first time. I'm just kidding. Like you review essentially. First of all, we must strive to have everything as public and as documented as possible, so that people can read the documentation and understand why of certain choices and why of certain processes, and hopefully, like even if like the first contribution would not actually follow what you are trying to, what you define for your as your practices. Like hopefully, like the idea is try to involve and bring these people and contributing to the technology the way you want. So it's a bit like he was mentioning, like creating like a strong culture and integrating like whoever is contributing in the fastest and the most reliable way possible. But it's usually even more complicated than in normal traditional software development because of the decentralized nature of what we are trying to build.
All right. I think that was the last question right now.
Cheers.